Hi, I'm David Hattner. I'm the conductor of the Portland Youth Philharmonic, and thank you for coming to this week's chat. We're going to have a fascinating time with two wonderful guests to talk about historic recordings of flute playing. And I'm always interested in woodwind playing of the past. As someone who sat behind flute players for many years in my work as a clarinet player, I think the instrument is fascinating because in many ways it's so simple, but the techniques of playing it are remarkably sophisticated, and they've developed much over the centuries. There have been great flute virtuosi going back probably to the beginning of time. And so we'll talk about a few from the fairly distant past, and unusually for mine, one of the players is actually still around. So that will be interesting to talk about as we go through it. So let's welcome Mary Schmidt, my former colleague from the Princeton Symphony, and Martha Long, the principal flutist of the Oregon Symphony. Hello to both of you. It's so wonderful for you to be willing to do this, to listen and just react to what you hear without preconceptions that names attached to things bring. So Martha, tell me about how you decided to become serious about playing the flute. So many people started, and only a select handful are willing to do the actual amount of work that it takes to become truly excellent.
Oh gosh, that's true. Every time I tell people I play the flute, I hear, oh, my mom played the flute, or I played the flute in high school or something, which is great. That's fantastic. I love that there are so many flute players out there. For me, the first competition that I ever did was when I was in 8th grade, and I auditioned for North Carolina's all district bands, and I ranked high enough to then go on to all state. And up until that point, flute had just been something that I really enjoyed doing, and I hadn't ever competed. But when I did compete and I got that positive feedback that I was advanced for my age or competitive compared to my peers, that sort of spurred me on. And once I realized that I could also do this for a living, that just made it seem really enticing, because it was something, playing the flute was something that not only challenged me, but that I enjoyed. Because there are a lot of things out there that challenge me, but not very many that I enjoy as much as playing the flute.
That's great. Yeah, the things you said brought back so many thoughts about, like, when did you realize that some of the things that you can do are like other people struggle with and stuff like that. It's interesting. So Mary, you studied with one of the legendary names in flute playing, Harold Bennett. Tell us something about him.
He was a master of sound and taught me how to listen. He was retired from the Met by the time I was studying with him, but at every lesson he would quiz me about what opera I had been to that week. And if I hadn't been to hear, some big name would come in, and he'd say, "Kid, it only costs $2 to get in. What are you doing?" And so he was very big on vocal sound, and also a master of teaching technique. He would home in on something that you needed work on and not let go of it until you had mastered it. And then you thought you were done, and he'd find something else in your playing that needed to be completely overhauled from the ground up and start on that. But, by the time I left school studying with him, it was amazing, the training that I got.
Yeah, you started working as a flute player fairly soon after graduation, right? Did you go to Tennessee?
Right. Yeah, I went to Chattanooga. I was pretty much right out of school. I think it was, again, like with Martha, it was just a couple months out of school.
So were you aware that there was sort of an organization to this pedagogy, or were just like, oh my God, I have all these things to do this week? Or did it make sense to you as it was being put together?
It completely made sense. Yeah.
That's great. So Martha, tell me about your teacher and who you would call your primary influence on your playing.
Well, I have two, but they sort of go hand in hand. So when I was in undergrad, I studied with Jim Walker, who used to be principal flute in the Los Angeles Philharmonic. And then my other main teacher is Elizabeth Rowe, who is now currently the principal flute in the Boston Symphony, but she also studied with Jim. So I sort of kept my heritage and my lineage intact, because I went from Jim to Elizabeth. And those are really my two main influences, but I was really lucky to have a lot of fantastic teachers and band directors all the way back to when I started in 4th grade.
That's great. Yeah, flute is a little like jazz in that there's a West Coast way of doing things, and I think didn't one of the retired LA studio players, I think, is retired to Oregon and is hanging around somewhere. So that's something that we might. Louise DiTullio, I think, has. I'm told, I shouldn't say this live on the air, but I'm told that she's living somewhere in our state, and that might be something to investigate for one of the Flute Association's future master classes if she's willing to do that. She's quite along with Jim Walker, a legendary name in the LA scene.
Definitely.
So why don't we transition over to the first of our recordings? I asked you which you thought was the best example from this, and you each had a different spot, but they ran right next to each other. So why don't we hear that from our track number 1? And on it goes. So I'm going to start with you, Martha, and tell me what struck you when you were listening to that the first time or the second time.
Well, so the first movement of that Bach Sonata in C major has 2 parts. It has the Andante, which we did not hear, and then it has the Presto, which we heard, and then we also heard a little bit of the beginning of the second movement. And just the thing that struck me about it, it was kind of backwards from the way that I approach this piece, which is that generally I take a little bit more freedom in the Andante section, and this performance of it was actually very metronomic. And then I am quite strict in the Presto, whereas this performance of the Presto was almost like a fantasia or almost like a cadenza. You know, it was very free and slowed down so much at the end that you're definitely not in Presto anymore. And at first I sort of thought, this is very strange. And then I thought, maybe I've been doing it backwards all these years. So it was actually a really refreshing take on the Bach. You know, I've played this piece, I don't know how many times since I was a teenager, but I've never even thought of it this way. And I really actually kind of liked it. And then also in the second movement, my students know the second movement because we use it as their double tonguing exercise. So they've all been playing that movement for years. The technical facility is just amazing. The articulation is sparkling, you know, and the player, whoever it is, doesn't add a slur the entire movement, take both repeats, I believe, and you know, has the facility to keep going and doesn't have even a hint of exhaustion, which is just amazing. I tend to get tongue-tied after, you know, half a page of double tonguing at that speed. So I don't know, my guess is that it's somebody French, but I really don't know. I'm excited to find out who it is.
Yeah, you know, this is a very old recording, and if you're listening as a recordings person, which I am in addition to liking the music, you can hear a little gap in the tape before the second movement starts, but nothing on either of the repeats. It's pretty much played straight through without stopping, and that would not be out of character for this particular player to be able to do. So Mary, same question.
Yeah, I agree with Martha. She said she thought it was someone French the first time through, but then I listened when I was just listening to the opening and then the Presto. For a minute, I thought it might be Rampal, but Rampal always does. He always flourishes at the end, and Rampal also takes breaks in the Allegro, so it wasn't Rampal. And then, you know, I thought, because I think I took 8 lessons with Julius Baker right at the end of my time in New York. And I thought, that's got to be Baker, because that's the way he taught that Allegro movement. You know, no breaks, just keep going, take the repeats, no cheating. And he he wouldn't hear you play anything in his studio unless you could play that from memory, that movement. And it had to be, you know, fast and bubbly like that. So I think that's Julius Baker.
Yeah, those New York guys had this kind of thing. His colleague Baker's in the New York Philharmonic, Robert McGinnis, who preceded Stanley Drucker in the clarinet chair. At the beginning of your lesson, you had to play this page of scales and thirds and all the keys. And if you made any mistakes, that was the end of your lesson for that week, and you had to come back the next week. So it doesn't surprise. We can do the reveal on this, and you can see that indeed it is Julius Baker.
Oh yeah.
With Sylvia Marlowe, this wonderful record set that went out of print and disappeared, but can be streamed in some countries, and it's been on a CD here and there. I think we have a picture of Mr. Baker. There we are.
Good call, Mary.
Yeah, just
But
a brilliant.
Was that way. Right, brilliant and just straight through. Don't look, don't look up. Just keep going. That's
in a time when if you wanted to make a recording or play something live, which everything was live and needed to be right the first time, he was the person that got called first for everything, because he could deliver a perfect, flawless performance of just about anything. And there wouldn't have to, when you're live on the radio, there is no take two. So
I have a little story about Baker. I never met him personally, but one of my teachers took some lessons with him, and they were studying some of the Anderson etudes, which are, flute players know are notoriously difficult. And I think they were doing Anderson Opus 60, which is subtitled The School of Virtuosity, and every etude is at least 4 pages and just terrible. I started working on them several years ago, and I'm still on maybe etude 9 or something. And my teacher asked Mr. Baker, he said, do you ever make a mistake when you're playing? And Baker said, there was one time I almost made a mistake. So there you go. Yes, he's the one who could lay it down live at a recording session.
Well, and he used to say, when the way you practice sets you up to be that way, because he would say in lessons, he'd say, if you never make a mistake, you'll never make a mistake. And he said, your mind has to be in the right place, and you just have to have good concentration, and you have to be looking ahead. And when you're practicing, he would advise you, if you think you're going to make a mistake, like those etudes from Opus 60, it's like, you're afraid. You're just afraid. I mean, I want to put blinders on, when I play those, because you're just afraid to look up because you'll make a mistake. He said, if you think you're going to make a mistake, stop, and then back up a measure and get ready and go. And if your fingers have never made a mistake in the passage, you'll never make a mistake when you're performing it.
Wow.
And I thought he was just being a wise guy. It's like, if you never make a mistake, you'll never make a mistake. It's like, ha, 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 that's very funny. But that really was his philosophy. That was the way he taught. If you think your fingers are going to miss, or, if you're going to run out of air before the end of the phrase, stop, back up a little bit, take another shot at it. And then if you've never done anything awkward in that phrase, it'll never happen.
Yeah, big believer in slow preparation. And just before I moved to New York, he made one of his last solo recordings, which you can still stream. Fortunately, it's still online. It's I should have looked this up. David Amram's, I think it's Variations on Red River Valley, kind of a cute Americana. But he was about late 70s, nearly 80 years old when he recorded, and it's just beautiful. I think having the same practice routine every day and all that there's a lot to be said for that. He was still playing recitals at Juilliard during my time in New York when he was in his 80s, and unfortunately I did not ever go, and I'm still sorry that I missed those, because that's an unrepeatable experience to have heard him.
For some of the younger students who, if they want to hear him, I believe that he's on the soundtrack, the original Disney soundtrack to Beauty and the Beast. There are a lot of huge flute solos in that, and I think Zach Galatis, my colleague Zach, who's the piccolo player in the Oregon Symphony, was telling me that Julius Baker recorded that flute part, and that he just came in and laid it down. And so if you've watched Beauty and the Beast, I think that's Julius Baker.
I think you're right. I know he did some things like that at the end, but when there was a recording to be made, people wanted that sound.
Yeah,
they wanted and all the things that came with it. I think he would tell people that one of the gigs he was most proud of Nobody under 40 will remember this, but the NBC logo used to be this peacock that opened up in animation. It had a little musical flourish that rose up, and there's a little flute trill that you could hear in the. Do you remember this, Mary?
I do remember.
And Julius Baker played that trill, and he got paid every time it was on, several times per hour, 24 hours a day.
Good for him.
And so it's like that was the best gig that I ever had.
That is a good gig.
Yeah. So, but most people nowadays have not ever seen that. So, well done, Mr. Baker. There's a lot of recordings of his that you can stream that unfortunately are not these box sonatas, but if you can always track down someone like me who's managed to hang on to the LPs despite moving across the country several times, never letting those go. And there's a set of handles.
I had to send to England. I bought those CDs a couple of years ago, and again after you posted this, I went up in the attic and got them out. And it's like they're CDs, but you can't get the LPs anymore. You still have those.
No, you have to track them down, and I actually found the Handel sonatas, which are the companions with Sylvia Marlowe, and at a good old Academy Records in New York, and I still have those, and they are wonderful. And unfortunately, a few things that got lost in transit were on his own record label, the Ibert Flute Concerto that he did with the CBS Symphony, which was a live broadcast, but it's out there somewhere. Somebody will reassemble all of that, I'm sure, because flute players are industrious.
Yes.
So should we move on to the Bernard Rogers Soliloquy, track number 2? And we have 2 different spots that Martha's picked that are similar musically. And then we have one more spot from later in the piece. So there we have it. Did you know this piece, Martha?
No, this was new to me, but I very much enjoyed listening to it. It's haunting and beautiful. Did you know this one, Mary?
Yeah, I have heard this one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Bernard Rogers was a wonderful composer whose music is heard not nearly enough, and he was the composition teacher of my predecessor here at the Portland Youth Philharmonic, Jacob Avshalomoff. So some of his music has been played by our orchestra a long time ago. So now, Martha, want to comment a little bit on the performance? And
Sure. Well, so this is another slightly older recording, not the dawn of the recording age, but somewhere in the middle, I think somewhere halfway between the beginning of recordings and where we are now. And we were talking about this before we went live. We were talking about the really fast vibrato that flute players used to use. And you can hear that in this recording. It's not really in vogue anymore, but it used to be pretty prevalent. So actually the reason that I chose this excerpt, those 2 excerpts, were that the musical material in the solo line is similar, but you're coming back towards the end of the piece, which is only about a 4.5-minute piece. You're hearing that opening line again, but this time, instead of it being unaccompanied, there's actually strings underneath. And it sort of made me think of 2 things. One, I wish that the recording equipment were a little bit more advanced so that you could really hear how the flute player is shading and shaping the line slightly differently, because even though it's similar musical material, somehow it's different. Like you've been through this emotional peak that's happened earlier in the piece, and now you're returning to this this opening that was, the first time we heard it was very lonely, and this time it's a little bit warmer and it's a little bit more introspective because it has the strings underneath it. And the other thing that it made me think of, which all of it ties together, is that I'm not much of a philosopher, but I do know I have one line, which is I think the Greek philosopher Herodotus, who said, you can't step in the same river twice. And that's, the idea that the water is always moving. So even if you're standing in the exact same place, you're not experiencing the exact same thing. So, and I love the way that can shape a piece of music, even if you're in the classical era and you have something that's very, concretely constructed. At some point you have an exposition, and later in the piece you have the recapitulation. And even though it's the same musical material, it's not, you've been somewhere else in the interim. You've been through the development, you've been through the storm of emotions and the swirl of different key signatures. And that makes the recapitulation different just by sake of all the other places that you've been. And so like I said, I just wish that the recording equipment captured a little bit more of what this flute player is doing differently, because it's very subtle. If you listen very carefully, you can hear that a note here or there is shaded differently, or less vibrato and then more vibrato. But I wish that we could really, really dig into everything. That I wish we could fully appreciate what was happening in that performance.
That's very good. Before I ask Mary the same question, I have some encouraging news in that the same flutist re-recorded the piece 10 years later in still in mono, but in high fidelity for its time. So there is some possibility of hearing another performance by the same exact forces, as it turns out.
Excellent.
So Mary, that's all the same question.
Yeah, this is a sound that you don't hear anymore. I don't know anybody playing now who approaches playing like this. It's there's a lot of air going across that lip plate, and as Martha said, the shaping and the phrasing is so incredibly beautiful and controlled. And that opening phrase, you grab the audience or you lose them right there, and if you don't grab them in that opening phrase, that's a long time to be standing up there with a flute in your hand and wondering, okay, now how do I get them back? It's and he does it. I mean, it's an amazing opening phrase, so controlled, and the way, if you listen to the entire excerpt, the way the piece comes to a climax and he leads that. It's wonderful. And I really love that sound. I admire that sound. And if it is the player that I think it is, it's interesting that these two excerpts are back to back, because Julius Baker also played this way. They, even though during their lifetime, flutes with, I don't want to say better, but different acoustical properties to the head joints and to the bodies, they became more prevalent. But these guys stuck with the old ways that, you would tune the flute to itself and then move the head joint out a little bit and roll it out a little bit, and then move a strong airstream very quickly across the aperture. And both of these men had that kind of way of playing, if it is who I think it is. And it's interesting how different they sound, even though I think they both approach the flute the same way. And again, with recording technology, was this an old 78 maybe?
It was, yes, this is from a 78 disc.
Yeah, when I was a kid, we would take 78s just to be silly and play them at 45. And we would take 33 RPM and play them at 16. But then when I was in high school, I realized that you could learn a lot about a person's vibrato, about the way they start a sound. If you take a 33, because by the time I was in high school, it was all 33 RPM, and flip it down to 16, you could hear everything they were doing. And I remember talking about this with Robert Dick once, and he did the same thing when he was a kid, totally geeking out with the phonograph player. And it's really interesting what you can learn when you slow those recordings down. I've not tried that with CDs. You know how you can put a CD in to, there are many programs that you can use, but like there's one called the Amazing Slow Downer.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you're trying to learn a jazz lick, you put the piece in the amazing slowdowner and you slow it way down. You can go, oh, that's what he's doing. And I don't know if, I've never listened to these recordings on that software, so I don't know if it's the same as a turntable. But
well,
so
I think
there is a benefit to a 78 RPM.
Right. I mean, the difference would be the amazing slowdowner would not change the pitch lower. It would keep the pitch similar and just slow it down. And other programs will do that. And yeah, I remember in sometime in school when we had to do like dictation homework, we would slow down tapes and things like that to try to get a slightly more accurate portrayal of that. So we can talk about who this player
I didn't have that ability to slow things down when I was doing dictations. That's unfair.
Yeah, if it was reel-to-reel tape, usually had a setting. So so we can look at the slide for this one, and you will see that Mary, your intuition was absolutely correct. It says Joseph Mariano, who was the professor and also at Eastman School and also the principal flutist of the Rochester Phil for a long, long time, and who attended the Curtis Institute of Music just slightly before Julius Baker. They may have even crossed over there in William Kincaid's studio for a year or two. So very similar background, but a hugely influential teacher, including his own student, Bonita Boyd, who still teaches at the Eastman School of Music. So I believe he started there around 1935. So we're nearing 90 years now of two teachers at that school. So that's pretty impressive.
That's amazing.
To me, Mary, when I hear that vibrato, it's like a middle ground between some of what was going on and what we now think of as, vibrating on the flute. It's not. It's very musical. It has variety, whereas some flute players, it was just on and it was very, very fast. And it was part of the sound, and it didn't really change expressively. Do you hear that as well?
Yeah, I definitely hear that, because there's a famous recording of Barrere who went on the Bing Crosby radio show, and I remember hearing that, and my eyes just bugged out. The vibrato was so fast, I couldn't believe what I was hearing.
Yeah, if you see the early Young People's Concert with Bernstein when John Wummer was still in the New York Philharmonic, it's that vibrato, very, very fast and unyielding. And early Kincaid has some of that quality, and then he evolved quite a bit. Do you hear the same thing?
Has mastered it, and can really make things with it.
Do you hear the same thing, Martha?
I do. I don't know nearly as much about this previous generation of player styles as you and Mary do. I really, the thing that I wonder about when I listen to it is I think how would something like that work in the orchestra? With Mariano, obviously there are shadings that he's doing, but I wonder about blending with the clarinet or a horn or something when you're using vibrato that's that fast. Did players at that time, how did they adjust in the orchestra? How did they blend with other instruments?
That's a very good question. Yeah. But there's a long catalog of recordings by the Eastman Rochester Orchestra in particular, which was the Rochester Philharmonic, just with not all of the players. Right. So it's possible to investigate that. But having read some recollections this week, preparing for this by his students, they talk about being in the Eastman Theater, listening to the Rochester Phil and hearing his sound like soaring over the orchestra quite effortly. So at least when he wasn't trying to blend, he was doing a very good job of that.
Right. Which is also important.
Certainly is. So now it's time to resurrect this piece, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Try to find, that all these solo wind pieces with string orchestras should be fairly easy to assemble, and it's a shame that they're not done nearly enough. This was part of I think this was a little 2-record set that had a solo of each of the woodwind principals of the time, and Hansen liked to do American music. Of course, he was a composer, and they did an American music festival every year at Eastman while he was the president of the school. And he loved to do that Winter's Past by Wayne Barlow for oboe and strings, which I think Marty Hebert has done a number of times with the Oregon Symphony. Beautiful, beautiful piece that unfortunately is expensive to rent, but other than that, is absolutely delightful. So I think we should talk about the next recording, which it may be the most obscure and fascinating of all of them. So let's hear the little excerpt we've chosen from that. So there's a lot of passage work in this piece. So let me start with you, Mary. And tell me what comes across to you in this performance.
Oh, the just absolute control of all it. If you listen to the whole thing, there's that real rapid passage work, and then there's all that twitchy stuff with the grace notes. The control that it takes to do that, and yet this person sounds like he or she is playing full on with a really big sound. And that's just marvelous.
What did you think, Martha? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mary.
It doesn't sound like a silver flute to me. So, and again, this sounds like one of those old 78s. So,
but definitely is. This is the oldest of the recordings we're hearing today, and this player was born well before the 20th century. And we can talk about the equipment as well when we get to the reveal, because that's a part of the story. So let me go to Martha.
Well, this piece was new to me as well, but I thought that, I mean, the technique is just dazzling. It's mind-bogglingly clear and clean and spectacular. There's one passage what I didn't ask you to play, but there's another passage where there's these descending runs, which for some reason I just have to admit that I think ascending runs are easier than descending runs on the flute. And it's like you can hear every single key going down. Or every single finger if it's a wooden flute. And everything is so clean and so measured and so accurate. It's wild.
It's uncanny, isn't it?
It's what?
It's uncanny, especially for that era. I mean, this is
really
a very
incredible.
Old
and if this is a pre-Boehm flute, I don't know. That's something that I would be really curious to know what sort of key system this person is using, because I hope that it's in a friendly key. Otherwise, I'm going to feel like I need to go to remedial flute technique school because they're doing things that are just incredible. The other side of it is that while the technique is so good, the sound quality is so strange. Whoever this player is arrives on the occasional long note, which doesn't happen very frequently in this piece, to be fair, but the sound quality, there's no vibrato whatsoever. Right. And it's almost like a swell into nothing, like a crescendo to a wall. It's a totally different approach to sound than what we would do today.
And I'm guessing this is not an orchestral player. Is it possible that this person just, kind of did this like the Doppler brothers in the 19th century?
Yeah, I think it will make sense to you when we should do the reveal and then continue to talk. So let's show this remarkable player. This is John Amadio, who is from Australia. So very far, and of course born in the 1880s. So very far away from any sort of musical center on earth. And I don't know exactly how self-taught he was, but very far away from the Paris Conservatory, of course. And I have some photos of his instruments, which are also interesting because they're not Boehm flutes. They're what were called Radcliffe system flutes, which is a different fingering system. You can find these photos on the internet. I think there's one more photo of, that's one of his, and he played flutes in different keys and of different materials for different kinds of pieces. So he had what he called a bass flute, and he had flutes in middle keys. So they weren't all C flutes. But he was a soloist, and he toured the world, including the United States, a number of times with various opera singers. He would play recitals where he would play those obligati from various operas, and then he would play, among other things, Carnival of Venice. And somebody on YouTube has remastered some of his recordings that are older than this one. And I have to say that of all the woodwind players I've heard in my life, I've never heard one more facile on his or her instrument than John Amadio. His ability to play with velocity is unparalleled in the history of anything I have heard, because this is the least. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, what year was this recorded?
This was 1926, so just into the era when microphones began to be used. Most of Amadio's recordings were made before that, so he was just playing into like a funnel, which acoustically etched the material into the disc. So one had to kind of blast your sound into there. But the things on YouTube, which I encourage you to check out, are some of the most dazzling and just mind-blowingly fast playing that you could just ever imagine. So he was well known and spent a lot of time in England. And yeah, I believe Moïse himself said Amadio may have been the greatest flute player who ever lived. So that there is some praise.
Yes. Moïse had phenomenal technique. It was, I heard a story about Moïse once that he learned the Hébert concerto on a train ride. Hébert gave him the piece, and then I forget where he was coming from or going to, but he sat there and solfeged the piece, got off the train, and played it at a rehearsal.
What?
Wow. Right? It's crazy.
Probably a little exaggeration in there.
Yeah, but still, But Moïse had fabulous technique.
Yeah, I mean, Moïse was the bridge. He was the bridge to the future in terms of sound and vibrato and all that. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, I thought at first, this might be somebody from the French school, but then like about 4 measures in, I realized, no, this is not French at all in any way, shape, or form. So, this guy's interesting.
Yeah, his is a unicorn. This is not. There's not a lineage descending from him to the present day. He is just somebody who just a freak of nature with incredible ability that either never knew there were supposed to be any limitations, or but I'm sure he dazzled audiences all over the world. I mean, considering what flute playing was like before the 20th century, it must have. I mean, there are obviously some great players based on what was written, but he didn't really do a lot of the repertoire. I believe he recorded some of the Mozart concerto movements around this time.
Wild.
Yeah.
I wonder how he phrases anything in those.
Yeah, right. And coming back to what we said earlier, that in this era, everything was done in one take. That makes this even more mind-boggling.
Yeah. Yeah, you had to play your 4 minutes of music, and that's there was nothing going into the middle. You'd either start it again, or that's what it was. So recording artists were reliable types. They could get it done. But I really wanted to include him. I discovered him completely by accident. I was in my early days. I was playing in the South Bend Symphony, and they used to put us with host families when they were consecutive rehearsal days. And somebody had a Victrola. And a stack of shellac records, and there was, I think it was probably the Carnival of Venice, and I listened to it. I was like, I got to remember this name, and I did.
That's amazing.
So I'll have very few things in my collection. I can look at his folder. There's a Chaminade, and interestingly, a demo record that was made of instruments of the orchestra for children, and he demonstrates both the flute and the piccolo on that. And I can point you both to where those are stored online, because those are not on YouTube.
Had you heard of him before, Mary?
No, I'd never heard of him before.
Me neither. No. Huh. Thank you for introducing us.
Yeah, right. That's bonus.
Yeah, this will be one you can amaze your friends with. So why don't we move on to the last track and see if you have any clue who might have done this playing?
Nope.
Well, there we have it. So, Martha, what strikes you about this in any way?
Well, obviously it's delightful just to listen to. It's such a fun little duet, you know. It's the style of playing, again, it's one of those things sort of like the previous piece, but in a different way, where the technical facility is there. It's, you know, everything is laid out and really clean, yet at the same time you have this sound that it's obviously a different approach to sound because it's, you know, jazz or samba, or I'm not sure exactly what style it is, but it's not a classical sound, and the articulation is rather explosive, but there is, you know, an understanding of vibrato, and sometimes a really nice deep resonant vibrato, but a lot of times the sound is very high in the overtones. So probably a lot of like overblowing going on. Yeah, I mean, it's delightful to listen to, and it's actually very hard to do. I cannot play like that even when I want to. I don't know. Can you, Mary? Are you versed in that style?
I can't do samba, bossa nova style.
Yeah.
I do improv, but not like that guy. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And it is a doubler, you know, because you can tell the way the air goes into the flute and the amount of air. And I've always admired that about doublers. Because when I was much younger, I did that myself. I used to play shows in the McCarter Theater in Princeton, and I was always alto sax, clarinet, and flute. And I found the clarinet would beat my lip up so badly. And I would work on reeds, I'd come home from a gig at 12:30 at night and work on reeds till my eyes were bleeding, you know. And then the next night I'd go through 6 more reeds on the clarinet. And I could never figure it out. Like how can somebody sound that good on the clarinet and that good on the flute? You know, these reed guys that play the flute, they just blow me away.
Yeah.
And the answer is they spend a ton of time with the flute. You know, that's what I think. It's and you gotta get pointers from. That was another thing that Harold Bennett was known for in New York. A lot of the jazz guys, a lot of the Broadway guys went and studied with Harold. Because, you know, he also, for a blink early in his career, was a doubler or tried to do that. And so he knew a lot of these guys. And they all went to Harold to get advice on how to make a good tone on the instrument. And, you know, there's no way to make a beautiful sound on the flute without spending lots and lots of hours with it. But I just so admire. I know who this is because I have this album.
Oh, you have it.
Because the guitarist is from New Jersey. You know, so...
Yeah.
But I just so admire the tone that he gets on the flute. It's amazing.
You're right. I mean, I can't imagine playing more than one instrument. And occasionally I have high schoolers say to me, well, you know, I want to play more than one instrument. And I say, do you even know what goes into playing one instrument well?
Right.
You know, do you know how many hours a day I spent in practice rooms, anywhere from 3 to 6 by myself, and then, you know, orchestra and lessons and chamber music and classwork and homework on top of that. And you want to do that on 2 instruments. So I can't imagine that somebody can be that good at more than one instrument. It's really mind boggling so this is a sax player who also plays flute.
Primarily a clarinetist.
Oh, okay. Clarinetist.
But
yeah.
Who started on saxophone? So we can do the reveal on this one, because this is a great album.
Yeah.
The great Eddie Daniels. With Bucky Pizzarelli, who sadly died not so long ago. That's the original cover of the album, which I wanted to use. It has a different cover on its iTunes version now. So you can hear this whole album. It's the most flute he ever recorded. And you can show the picture of Bucky. There he is with his primary gig these days.
Yeah.
And
clarinet are so different.
There he is.
I don't understand how you can be good at both of them, you know?
I know, because it's just, to me, I guess because I started on flute. I think if you start on the reeds, you figure out a way, because you build up calluses that flute players don't have. And I just could never make the clarinet work. And I finally just stopped doubling because I got so frustrated. I tried different mouthpieces. I think I tried, 9 different brands of reed, like I said, working on them. Oh, it's ridiculous. And my saxophone teacher was so cool and so nice. And he said, man, you sound great on saxophone. It's like the person I was taking clarinet lessons with would just sit there like, looking at the watch. Is this lesson ever going to end?
No.
It was brutal. But yeah,
clarinet
Eddie Daniels.
Eddie Daniels is
great sound on the flute.
Yeah, he's just a sound person in his playing on every instrument. He was obsessed with tone quality. He still plays clarinet. He practices every day. But when he got a Broadway gig playing the show Mame, he had to play flute. So he went to Harold Bennett. He went to Julius Baker. Tom Neifinger also studied with all of them, did his 10,000 hours, and made this record. So
excellent. Yeah, and Bucky Pizzarelli he's a New Jersey guy. So he and his son they're just, anybody who lives in New Jersey knows those guys. So, and we all own, I think every house in New Jersey has at least one Pizzarelli album in it.
Well, they're also great.
They're such nice people too, that family.
Oh, you know,
it's always interesting.
What's that?
Sorry, do you both know them personally?
No, I've just seen them like backstage and stuff, The younger one, I've never played with the older one, but the younger one, he's just so nice.
Local legends.
Yeah, exactly. Local boy makes good.
Good.
Yeah, they sure did. I was interesting, when people learn an instrument and they try to improvise on it, he's really thrown himself out there with a lot of wide intervals, and really you've got to be thinking ahead of like exactly where you're headed so you don't end up falling down the stairs. But I encourage you, Martha, to find Blue Bossa online and listen to all the tracks, because he even plays the Iber Entr'acte on this album, which is not jazz at all. But the other jazz tracks they're just fantastic. I mean, just real great facility and total command of the improvisation. And there haven't been that many flute primary jazz players, I imagine. Almost most of them have started.
Laws. Yeah.
Right. Steve Kajala.
Herbie Mann.
Yeah.
Valentino. What's his name? Dave Valentin. But
yeah, a couple of months ago we were talking about jazz, and we played some recordings of Yusef Lateef, except he was playing the oboe on those, but he was also a really good flute player and a very interesting musician out of Detroit.
Yeah. I loved his flute sound.
Oh, Yusef Lateef is great on everything.
Yeah, an amazing, and you would recognize Yusef Lateef even if you've never heard him before. The first time you hear that sound, you go, "Oh man, that's from outer space." Who is that guy? And you'll look, it'll be Lateef. What a mind! And hearing him play, like he'll play bass clarinet and then pick up the flute and then go back to the bass clarinet. It's amazing.
Yeah, his oboe playing's tremendous also, and he even played the bassoon a couple of times, amongst some other things. But his signature is the very behind the beat style, like very late, and that's what makes him recognizable to me. But Eddie Daniels, I guess I don't know that he plays flute or sax in public anymore. I don't know whether he practices them, because his clarinet career took off in the 80s and really, I mean, we all know who he is, and anyone who could go on live TV and play solfeggiato, my hat is off to them, because I can't even play the first two lines of that in the tempo that he plays it.
Yeah, and the improvisation thing, I think that's something everybody should do just for fun, even if you never do it in public. And the sooner you do it, the better. It's to teach an adult. I have an adult student now, and she's doing really, really well. But I really admire her courage, because she took up the flute several years ago, and then she said, "Okay, I want to learn jazz now." And she doesn't have all the training that high school students receive. Even if you never take a theory course in high school, you've heard all kinds of theory from your teachers and your band director or orchestra director. And she doesn't have any of that background. And yet, there she is, improving away. And there are so many more aids to learning that now. When I was a kid, you had to go down to the music store and order the Jamie Aebersold album that recently came out and wait for it to arrive and then ride back over there on your bike and pick it up, back in my day, right? But now, there's so much stuff online to help you. You can just type in, if you're learning the B flat blues, you just go on Google and type in backing track for B flat blues, and like 6 of them will pop up, and they're all usable. and various tempos. And if you don't like the tempo, you drop it in the slow downer.
Right.
I haven't thought of that, but that is quite an innovation to be able to
Yeah.
to be able to do that. It's like there are all the tuning drones on YouTube that you can use if you want to play scales with them.
I love
you're too lazy. Yeah. So Martha, are players that are coming through the conservatory system dealing with improvisation, either in old or new music now?
Ooh, that's a great question. So my teacher, Jim Walker, who was he was with the Los Angeles Philharmonic for a long time, actually left the Phil when he was sort of like in the middle of his career and went into jazz in the studios. So he occasionally would come in to our weekly flute studio classes and say, "All right, everybody on your feet, we're improvising today," and we'd all go, "Oh no." But it would usually be sort of in a jazzy style. He just wanted us to be exposed to everything, and he wanted us to know when we chose to go in a certain direction that we had tried everything. And as for contemporary improv, sort of like what the International Contemporary Ensemble or Eighth Blackbird does, I know some places teach things like that. Like I know when I went to the New England Conservatory for graduate school, I know that they have a sort of a contemporary music division where you can focus on jazz, or you can focus on sort of more atonal, sort of serialistic improvisation. I don't know how much you can improvise under serialism, but that they have there are people out there that do that. It wasn't really a big part of my education, but I knew from a relatively early age that the orchestra was the direction that I wanted to go, and I was sort of hyper focused, even for a musician, I think relatively early on. I mean, I started taking professional auditions during my undergrad, so I was not really. I had sort of decided very early on that was the route that I wanted to go.
I did the same thing. So that's exactly what I tell my students not to do now. It's like all the things that I did focused on, don't do any of them. And the ones who have followed my advice are doing really, really well.
Yeah, because I mean, it could have very easily backfired on me, but thank goodness it did not.
So, Mary, did you teach jazz band?
Yes.
When you that was part of your portfolio?
Yep. Mm-hmm. So I had to learn to play the electric bass because I had to teach kids how to play the electric bass. And it's always been my philosophy of teaching anyway. Every couple of years, I try to take up something new from scratch, something I've never done before. And I'm telling you, learning to play the bass was not easy, but it helped me teach kids how to do it. I mostly taught kids that were 12, 13, and 14 how to play the bass. And then, teaching kids just basically swing style it involves a lot of listening. So in a year when you had students who were happy to do a lot of listening, or their parents had, they owned a lot of albums with that style on it, those kids could play anything. And the earlier I got to them, I would try to get them improving in 6th grade. And because they don't even know, they don't know, is this right? Is this wrong? Is this good? Yeah, kid, it's all good, and just keep doing it. And they're not afraid to stand up in public. They'd stand up at school assemblies, they'd stand up at concerts in front of their parents, Tout le monde was there, and they just stand up and start improvising. It was great.
That's great. I love what you said. Oh, sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I love what you said about learning swing style, because I remember when I started in the San Antonio Symphony, about half of our season was pops.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, I had spent all this time learning orchestral excerpts and taking orchestral auditions to get into an orchestra. And I didn't realize that half the music that I would be playing was not necessarily classical.
Right.
And one of my best friends in that orchestra was our principal trombone player, and she had gone through the same ordeal. But for her, as a brass player, it was a little bit more apparent. And apparently during her first year in the orchestra, one of the other brass colleagues said to her, "You know, you swing like a rusty gate." So it is really important, even if you think you're going to have an orchestral career, or even if you want to have an orchestral career, to be well versed in all these different styles, because they will all come across your stand at some point or another. And even in Oregon Symphony concerts, we have solos that members of the orchestra have to take. Right. And I'm always the person who's like, no, not me, thank you very much. But somebody stands up and does them, and those people are really incredible to be able to shift genres like that.
Yeah, one of the important tools for that is playing by ear.
Yeah,
which again, who is trained to do that? My mother's father was actually both of my mother's parents were pianists, and my grandmother had played in a silent movie house. So, she'd come in before, hours before the movie, and she'd sit and watch the screen and say, okay, I'm going to play this there. I'm going to play this there. And how do I connect them? And then, she'd have to improvise connections between all this stuff. And my grandfather was a jazz, stride pianist. And like we lived with them for a time, and he'd come home from work and he'd sit down and start playing something. And there's no music on the rack. It's like, how are you doing that? He said, I don't know. I heard it on the radio. It's a really cool tune, isn't it? And he'd just sit down and start playing it because he could play by ear. And I think from watching them do that, I just thought everybody did that.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No.
But yeah, listening is key. So.
Yeah. So this has been great. Why don't I close this out, and we'll chat in the green room for a few minutes. Thank you both. This was terrific, and hopefully somewhere down the road we'll do something like this again.
This was a lot of fun.
It was great. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. We are still figuring out when exactly the next one of these is going to be, sometime next month, and we've got some interesting ideas for topics. So check our website, check our YouTube page, and if you've never heard the Portland Youth Philharmonic play, definitely watch one of the videos of the orchestra. It's one of the more remarkable things going on in the northwestern part of the country. And do listen to the playlist from its original source, because it will sound quite different than it does on these videos. So thank you very much. We want to thank our sponsors for this program. You can hopefully see them on your screen before this closes out. And we will be back in front of you very soon. Thank you, everyone.